All right. Well, hey everybody. Welcome everybody on live. All right. Have we got a question to start, Melanie?
Would you like to start with that other question that came through earlier?
Hey guys, do
No.
we pray?
Sorry?
Do we pray?
Let's
Do we pray? What are you, a Christian or something? Goodness
No,
me.
that's actually a really
You know,
good
that's
idea.
a fair call. Why don't you pray for us, Lou? Because clearly your pastors have forgotten how to pray. So, let's pray.
Heavenly Father, I just thank you for this evening. I thank you that you are God, a God who created the world, who created sex, and that we can talk openly about it.
Yes.
I pray now, Lord, that you would really give us some good open conversations, and that we would really understand your heart and your vision and the way that you want to see things and want things done. We just lift this time to you now, into your hands. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Hey, if you're online and if you've got a question, you can put your question in the chat. Tavita will relay that to me, and we'll make sure that we include you in what's going on. So why don't we start? We've got a couple of questions in the inbox. You can send more if you like. Go for it, Melanie.
Okay, so first question is, if God doesn't want people to have sex till they're married, why did he make them so that they want to have sex?
Good question.
Let's start with it.
That's a really good
No.
question. Why give people a desire for something that he doesn't want us to desire until we're married? You want to have a crack at this?
I think it's absolutely.
One of the things that Jesus used to do when he was asked about marriage and he was asked about relationships, he always went back to the Garden of Eden in Genesis. Okay, because that is really where we get the picture of what God intended for us. Everything after the garden is a distortion, or it's a movement away from what God intended. For those of you who are new to the Christian faith, basically what happened, God created Adam and Eve. He asked them not to take from a tree called the knowledge of good and evil, and they did. They decided they were going to take fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil was basically a way of saying, I want to decide what's best for my life. I don't want God to decide, I'm going to decide. And so in that moment when Adam and Eve, or humankind, decided we will decide what's right and wrong for our life, God said, okay, you've got to accept that there are consequences if you make the wrong choices. Okay? So the first thing is this. I think we need to remember is God never intended for us to wrestle with sexual desires without him included in that conversation. His original intent was for us to be in relationship with him so that we would know how to use our bodies and how to conduct our relationships in a way that is most healthy and most edifying for ourselves and each other. When we depart from God's way, when we say, God, I can figure this out for myself, well, what ends up happening is we end up making decisions that are not always consistent or in line with God. Now, so that's one part of that response. But I think the other part is this. When God created Adam and Eve, he said, go and tend the garden. Go and look after the garden. Okay, he creates this amazing garden. He says, go and tend it and look after it. And he said to all the creatures on earth, go forth and multiply. Okay? So the natural DNA for creation, including human beings, is to multiply, to procreate. Okay? And sex is part of that. And so part of that instinct or that desire inside of us ties back to that procreation. But with Adam and Eve, he gave them one other instruction. He said, tend the garden and look after it. What tending a garden means is to keep it in order, keep it in its boundaries. He never gave that instruction to any of the animals. He just said to the animals, go and make more animals. Go and make more horses, go and make more cows, go and make more dogs. All right, so the boundaries of using sexual desire for animals, they don't exist. They're just there to make babies, that's it. All right? For humans, God created us with a little bit more. He said, I don't want you to just make babies, I also want you to experience intimacy that I designed you to experience. I want you to know what it feels like to be closely connected to your God. And the closest thing that human beings have to having an experience where we can feel one with another person is through sexual intimacy. And so what God says is, tend the garden. I've given you this amazing gift, but I need you to be responsible for it. And responsibility is really God's way of saying, I actually trust you. I believe in you. This is not an evil thing. This is not a bad thing I've given you. But I'm putting boundaries around it so that you can stay safe, that you can make great choices. And so going back to the question of why would God give us the desire if he doesn't want us? God wants us to have sex. But he wants us to do it within the boundaries that he's given us so that it gives us the best outcomes for our life. All right? Sex is not bad. And I know, unfortunately, the church has made it seem like that. But sex is a gift from God. But he's just put boundaries around it and said, hey, it's your responsibility to look after those boundaries because I trust you. You're not an animal. You can think for yourself. And if you stay connected to me, and that's how he intended it to be, if you stay connected to me and make your decisions about right and wrong with me in the picture, well, then you're not going to find those boundaries a problem. It's only when we depart from connecting to God, when we say, God, we can figure this out for ourselves, that we end up making decisions outside of the boundary. And it's a little bit like the illustration I used last week. Sex is a little bit like a fire. When it's in the fireplace, it's terrific. It's helpful, it's useful, you can cook on it, it keeps you warm. But you put the fire in the middle of your living room, you're going to have some problems. And this is really where God said, hey, I'll put a fire in you, but you've got to keep it in the fireplace. And that's your responsibility. Because one of the things we know is that children never learn how to be responsible if we don't give them opportunities to be responsible. God didn't want us to be robots. He wanted us to grow up and be responsible image bearers of his creation. And so he says, hey, I'm going to give you the responsibility because I believe in you, but I also want you to grow up. And part of growing up is trusting me to guide you in the right decisions for your life, including sex. Does that sound like a reasonable
But I think also
response?
what we take, what is missing is that God created us for a relationship first. You know, and so quite often, like you said today, it is very transactional now, and we're missing the relationship, and that's why it's like, okay, well, that relationship's not working, so I'll just go to the next relationship, and we don't realise that the intimacy with another person is being, I suppose, diluted every time we have intimate, we have sex or we become intimate with another person, and then but not only with another person, but with God, because that's where our relationship starts.
True. So if we start with God as the most important relationship, then we can use, not use is a bad word, we can conduct our relationships in a way that is most in line with what God intended, and we can enjoy the gifts that he's given us, including sex, in the right way, rather than getting messed up.
Okay, this one's a really good question.
Okay.
I sleep with my boyfriend or my girlfriend, but don't sleep around. I'm respectful and kind to others, so what's the real problem?
Yeah. And that's a fair question.
It's a very good question.
Could you turn around and grab me a biscuit over there, please? Yeah, that one would be perfect.
It's an illustration. It's not hungry.
I'm hungry. I'm hungry.
I eat when I'm confused too.
Are you stalling?
No, I'm not stalling. No. It's an illustration. Okay, I think this is a really good one because this is, I think, the way most young people think about sex and relationships today. Is if I'm not sleeping around and it's consensual and I'm not being mean to anybody and I'm not using anybody, hurting anybody, what's the problem? And you know what? Fair enough. That's a really reasonable question to ask. I would say a couple of things. Everything I say tonight is based on what I understand the Bible to say, all right? And the Bible sometimes says things that are not always consistent with what everybody else thinks, right? So the question I want to ask myself is, why would the Bible even say that? It seems reasonable if you're not sleeping around and you're not being, you're committed to somebody. It seems reasonable. Why would the Bible say something like this? Well, there's a couple of things. Okay, the first thing is this. I think one of the reasons why the Bible asks people to wait till they're married is because marriage, at least in the Bible sense of the word, is a commitment to one person for the remainder of their life. Now, I know we live in a world where marriage is really not that. Marriage is more, I'll marry you until we get divorced, you know. But in the biblical sense of the word marriage, marriage is saying to somebody, I commit to you forever. And I'm going to protect you, and I'm going to love you, and I'm going to care for you in sickness and in health, for better and for worse, till death do us part. The reasons they say that in the vows is because there's no out until you accept that unless you die. All right? Now, that's the ideal. That's what God says, hey, this is the healthiest for you. Why is it the healthiest? Well, one, throughout history, the most vulnerable human beings are women and children. Okay? Women and children have the most potential for being exploited, for being hurt, for being taken advantage of. And one of the reasons the Bible says, hey, don't have sex until you're married, is because it's trying to uplift the value of women, because especially in the times of the Bible, women were property. They weren't treated as equals. They didn't have rights. They were just property. And so if a man wanted to have sex with a woman, he would just take what he wanted. There was no care about whether she consented. There was no care about whether she'd be left with a baby. There's no care about the fact that if she had had sex, nobody else would marry her, and then she would probably live her life without a partner. And so women were very, very vulnerable. And so one of the reasons the Bible says, hey, if you want to have sex, you need to value the person that you're sleeping with, because that person is the image of God. And you need to protect them and care for them and love them, not just take from them what you want. And so part of it is actually really, really important for women. And even today, we're having the same conversation about women being treated with respect within the boundaries of sexual relationships. Even today, all over the media, we're talking about, you know, the Me Too movement and men taking advantage of women in the arena of sex. Why? Because when we go back to just our animal instincts, what usually happens is women come out second best. And so marriage actually protects women in that regard, and it's really important. The second thing is this: marriage gives value to the person that you are both being most intimate with. It says, you know what? You're more than just a feeling. You're more than just an impulse. I am committing my life to you, and that adds value to the person. God values humanity. God sees humanity as his precious, precious children. And he doesn't want any of his children, women or men, to be just used as objects. And so part of the reason he says, hey, wait till you're married, is because you need to wait for somebody that values you enough, that would take care of you and love you the way that you deserve to be loved. Now, the third thing I would say is this: sex is not just physical. Sex is spiritual and it's emotional. And every single time you are intimate with another person, you are giving part of yourself to that person, emotionally and spiritually. The reason I wanted this biscuit is this: every time you have sex, you give a little bit of your soul to the other person. And let's say you have more than one sexual partner before you get married. A little piece of you gets broken off, and you never get that piece back. That piece stays with the other person. And the longer you engage in casual sex, the more you disintegrate your identity as a person, emotionally and spiritually. And what ends up happening is, when the time comes that you want to commit to somebody,
Yeah.
what you're bringing is a fractured version of yourself. And I think if we're honest, most of us bring fractured versions of ourselves to our relationships. We all come with our broken pieces. And what that does is it creates added complications to the relationship that God never intended us to have. God never intended us to be fractured and broken. He intended us to be whole and complete. And as we unify with the other person who we're marrying and committing to, then something beautiful happens. We get to experience the image of God together. So, what would I say to somebody who is sleeping with their boyfriend or their girlfriend and not hurting anybody and being committed? I would say, I understand. I do. I really do understand that. One, it's really hard in today's society to have a relationship without sex being on the table. But I would also say that unless you know 100% without a shadow of a doubt that this is the person you will end up with the rest of your life, and you can't really know that until you're standing in the aisle, then be mindful of how it's going to affect your future, the impact it will have on your future relationships. Now, with all of that said, I want to say this. If you have already had sex and you're not married, God doesn't throw away broken pieces, okay? And that's really important to remember. Even if you feel like you've gone too far, God doesn't reject us and He doesn't throw us away. And God does heal the broken. God does give value to the people who are considered valueless. Jesus met a woman at a well one day, and she was a Samaritan woman. And Samaritans in Jesus' day were like considered by the Jews to be second-class citizens. They couldn't stand them. They were half-caste Jews, and they didn't like them at all. Here's Jesus sitting at a well, talking to a woman in the middle of the day. The reason she was at the well in the middle of the day is because she was a lady that slept around with a lot of men. And she was so ashamed that she had to go in the hot middle of the day so that nobody else would see her and give her a hard time. And Jesus called her out. He said, hey, I know you've had 5 husbands. And I know the guy that you're sleeping with right now is not your husband. But I want you to know what you're searching for in those men, you're not going to find. What you're searching for is living water. And if you come to me, Jesus said, if you come to me, I'll fill that void that you're looking for. And this is really where it comes down to, is wherever we are on this journey, you know, whether we've slept with someone outside of marriage or not, whether we feel broken or whether we feel whole, if we're chasing relationship just for the physical, we're selling ourselves short. We're missing out on everything God can give us. And I just want to say one more thing. I say this because I failed. I say this because I didn't wait till I was married before I had sex. But the consequences of that is I brought a whole lot of brokenness into my marriage. I brought a whole lot of baggage into my marriage that we've had to work through together, because you never get away scot-free. It's never just a physical act. There's always something there. And so I'd encourage you, if you can wait, because it will be better. Does that make sense? Is that a reasonable response?
I've got a question.
Yeah. So,
as a parent that had a child before we were married,
scandalous.
I know.
Because your husband knows.
yes, he does know, and my children know. You know, so the question is, what conversation do we have with our kids?
Yeah.
You know, as parents that we're not the only parents that have had children before we got married. What conversation do you have with your kids?
Okay.
So our kids have questions, just so.
Okay, so just in case you're not aware, this is how transparent we want to be. Melanie and I were not married when we had Kai. Okay? We had Kai before we were married. And our kids all know that.
Yeah.
Our kids know that before we were walking with Jesus, we lived a different way. And one of the questions they've asked is, well, why would you tell us to wait to be married if you didn't wait to be married? And that's a fair question. From a parent's perspective, I would say this. As a 20-year-old, I went through a phase where I drank a lot of alcohol. And I did some pretty big damage to my relationships, to myself, to my work. It wasn't good. The outcomes of living that way weren't great. As a result, as a parent, one of the things I've encouraged my boys to do is to avoid drinking. Not because I'm trying to get them to miss out on what I did, but it's because I've experienced the downside of it, and I want to protect my kids from it. So from a parent's perspective, I would say, even if you messed up, still encourage your children to wait, because you know the downside of it, all right? From a kid's perspective, I would say this. If your parents are asking you to wait, there's probably a good reason for it. And it's really hard for teenagers to know or to even believe that their parents would know anything about their life and what they experience. But they do, and they've been where you are. And if they're encouraging you to wait, then I would encourage you to ask them, tell me why. Tell me why you want me to wait. And then take it seriously when they tell you. Because you'll find that you may learn something about your parents, and you might learn something about life and avoid some of the pitfalls that your parents tried to warn you about just by listening. Does that make sense? Yeah? Does that?
Yeah, and hindsight, and I say this to our boys, right? Hindsight's such a wonderful thing. Do we, at 20 years down the track, I wouldn't change having Kai for anything in the world, but do we wish we'd done things differently?
Sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Absolutely.
But we are very honest with our boys. They know.
All right. Have any other questions?
No, there have been no. Does anyone have any questions? Text me now.
Go on, Kat.
Oh,
No.
how do we have that conversation with our kids? I've got teenage kids.
Yeah. Which
Well, one in
conversation are we talking
Like
about?
about saving himself
Yeah.
for, for marriage and, it's just,
What? It's a hard conversation to have. And it's a hard conversation to have when they're teenagers. One of the things that I would say is, if you have the opportunity, start young. Talk to them about the importance of marriage when they're not teenagers, and then you up the conversation as they get older. So you make it age appropriate. So the first conversation we had with Kai about sex was when he was 5 years old. Now, that's because he asked. He said, where do babies come from? And so we said, well,
I said, go ask your dad.
So, at 5 years old, it was like we were talking about eggs and seeds, and when eggs and dad has a seed and mum has an egg, and when the egg and the seed come together, it makes a baby. And then, being the cluey little clock that he was satisfied with that answer. He said, yeah, but how does the seed get from the dad to the mum? Well, when he's 5, we talked about special cuddles, and we didn't go into too much detail, okay? And then as he got older, he said, what do you mean special hugs? What do these special hugs look like? So we had to unfold the conversation as they got older. So I would say to parents, if you've got young children, talk to your young children about those things in age-appropriate ways. So what it does is it makes the conversation open. It's not awkward, it's not weird, it's just like, let's talk about it, okay? If they're already teenagers, what I would say is this. I would look for if your son's dad is in his life, then I would say involve dad in that conversation, because dads play an important role in boys' lives where it helps them to sort of navigate things. If your son's dad is not in his life, and you've got to have those conversations, one of the things that is really helpful for boys is this. do something else while you're talking to him about that. Okay? So don't sit down and say, hey, I'd like to have a conversation with you, because he'll want to crawl under the table and go up. Okay? Ladies have conversations about heart stuff. Men don't. Men do stuff, and while they're doing stuff, they have conversations about heart stuff. Does that make sense? Yeah. So while a boy is throwing a ball, he'll talk to you about what's going on in his life. But if you sit him down at the kitchen table and ask him what's going on in your life, he won't say anything. Right? So you find opportunities to just hang out, do stuff that's incidental, and then as you're talking, to say, hey, any girls in your life? And you have that conversation as a casual thing, not as a formal, in-your-face run. Okay, so that's the method I would approach. As far as the actual conversation itself is, I think we've got to remember that everything the Bible says is for people that follow Jesus. And so one of the questions I guess you've got to ask is, okay, where is your son at in terms of his relationship with Jesus? And that really frames how you would have that conversation. To say, hey, as a believer, I think it's great to wait till your marriage. And these are the reasons why. What do you think about that? Now, he might have a totally different perspective, and if he's not a follower of Jesus, he will definitely have a different perspective. Okay? And so what you do is you leave the door open for the conversation to continue. But one thing I would avoid is, if you're a Christian parent with, say, a non-Christian child, don't ever try and hold them to Christian values. Christian values are a covenant. A covenant is a contract that is an agreement between two people, namely you and Jesus. And so if you have a covenant with Jesus to follow him, his rules apply to you. They don't apply to the person who doesn't have a covenant with Jesus. And so what we do is we leave the door open and say, hey, this is what I believe. Have you thought about it? And then leave it at that. And then if they open the door to that conversation, then probe further. Does that make sense?
Yes. I think the biggest thing is our kids have to know it doesn't matter what they say, it's safe.
Yeah.
They've got to know there's going to be no judgment, because otherwise they don't. That's when they go out looking into the world for answers and for information. And we can't ever be shocked by what our kids tell us or judge them, because they won't come to us, and that closes the door to you having that conversation.
Yeah.
We have to be the safe place for our kids to come, irrespective of whether we agree with their choices or not. Because those opportunities lead to us being able to have that conversation. And one thing that Tarun and I have always had with our kids is nothing's off the table. Nothing at all is off the table. We started a conversation, we were talking about Black Lives Matter, and because that was what was all over the news at the time, and then that morphed into a conversation about abortion and all kinds of things, and it was just such a really great conversation to have with the boys, that they felt safe enough, to talk to us about it, and it gave us opportunity to have conversations about all those. But if we are so staunch on our position of, our position based on our faith, and it's a faith that they may not understand, they're not going to come to you. You're not going to be. The opportunity for you to have that conversation with him will be closed forever. And so they have to know that we are their safe space. And nothing's off the table, and that's okay.
Good question. Does anybody else have a question?
Is there ever a reason to have sex before marriage?
Is there ever a reason to have sex? I could give you a dozen reasons, Tavita.
No, this isn't for me. Like,
Asking for a friend.
yeah, I'm asking for a mate.
Asking for a friend. Well, look, I would say this. I think if you're looking for reasons, then you're probably missing the point.
Yeah.
That's like saying, is there ever a reason to drink and drive? You can drink and drive. You may not get into drinking and driving. But there's pretty good evidence that there's going to be consequences if you drink and drive.
Yeah.
And if you're looking for reasons, then you're probably already going to do it. And so this is really not a conversation that is worth having. I think you've got to ask yourself, why are you looking for reasons? Why? And if you're looking for reasons, it's probably because you've got a deep need or craving inside that you're trying to fill, and you're hoping that you can circumvent the good advice that God gives us. That's right. Good advice never changes, and facts don't care about your feelings.
Yeah.
So
pastors.
when you so look, I would just say, ask yourself why. Why do you want to go around the boundaries? If you're not a believer, then have at it. Honestly, I do not believe in trying to hold non-believers accountable to Christian values. It's just not what the Bible teaches. The Bible holds Christians accountable to Christian values. If you're a believer, then you've got to ask yourself, well, why do I follow Jesus? And if I do follow Jesus, then is there a way of living that's going to lead to life? Or is there a way of living that leads to death? And then make that choice accordingly.
Okay. You
Weapon. Gosh. Wow. Be careful.
you used a pretty cool analogy about the biscuit, like giving part of yourself to part of yourself to to other people. If that's already happened, how do you get whole again? And when it comes to purity and
Great
whatnot,
question. Great.
is it still important?
If I had a bit more time, I would set up another illustration. Okay, but I'm going to describe something to you, and I want to see if you can picture it in your head, and see if this helps you. All right. If I've got a glass of water and I put some food colouring in it, let's say that the food colouring is red. The water in the glass would be what colour? Red. Okay. So let's for argument's sake, for illustration's sake, saying you had sex before marriage and you feel like there's some kind of stain in your life, kind of like putting red food colouring into water. Okay. There's nothing you can do to get the food colouring out, except one thing. Well, you could try and put artificial chemicals inside, but that might have alternative impacts. The best way to get food colouring out of water is to add more water. And the more water you add, the more diluted the food colouring will become, until eventually you will not see any food colouring again. Jesus said, if anyone thirsts, come to me, and rivers of living water will flow from your life. What he's saying is, if you feel stained, fill yourself up with my living water, and my living water will help to cleanse you of whatever stain you are carrying. You can't get the stain out of your life yourself. You can't undo the past. I wish I could. I wish I could go back in time and undo all the stupid decisions I made in my 20s and my 30s and in my 40s and probably in my 50s as well. But I wish I could undo all the stupid mistakes, but I can't. All I can do is keep going back to the Father and saying, God, I need you to fill me again.
Yeah.
I need you to replace the imperfection that I've put into my life with your perfection, so that your perfection is more than my imperfection. So, kind of like what I talked about this morning, and if you missed the sermon, go and watch it on YouTube. If we prioritise chasing God, then it doesn't matter what we've done or what's happened to us in the past, because the priority of God will overwhelm our personal physical desires. And over time, the past will become less as he becomes more. I think that was John the Baptist said that, I must decrease so that he can increase. So whatever stain you're carrying, whatever broken biscuits you're carrying, fill yourself up with Jesus and let him replace that with his perfect love.
Yes, good. Yeah, questions?
I liked what you said about if you're parenting
Mm.
that you can't hold more Christians to Christian values.
Yeah.
Something that went through my mind, and maybe this is the nursing me, I was thinking as well that in that conversation also there is, and young people get this a lot from school as well, there's also as well that whole rhetoric around consensual relationships and safety as well. Because as you say, we may be talking to our young people, but they are ultimately have to make that decision
That's
of
correct.
how they run their lives.
Very.
And I guess maybe, rightly or wrongly, I come from the basis of I can but to show them and teach them, they will make that decision. But I need to make sure as well that the bottom line is, are they safe in their behaviours?
Yes.
And whatever they're
Yes.
doing, are they safe? Are they being respectful to other people?
Yeah.
And are they being safe? So that covers all of your
Yeah.
birth
You're right.
control and everything,
Yeah.
all of that sort of scenario.
And we shouldn't be leaving that to the schools to have those conversations with our kids.
Yeah.
You know, because we're better to know what's going on with our kids so we can have the appropriate conversations with them, and then we know what's being, what they're being told, because we're the ones telling them, and so, and you're right, ultimately they're going to make their own decisions,
Yeah.
but they need to know that they can come back to us and it's always safe
Yeah.
to come back to us. No
I
matter.
can't presume
No,
that
that's
I
right.
can't presume how I live my life would be how my two teenage
Yes,
girls
that's correct.
live their lives.
They just got to know that you love them and respect them. That's the decision that they make.
I mean, to your point, Louise, I agree with you. I would say that there are general moralities that we agree with in society that everybody would be wise to adhere to. I wouldn't say should, but would be wise to. And so when you talk about being safe and conducting yourself in a relationship in a way that doesn't lead to harm for you or the other person, I would call them universal morals. But then there are biblical morals. That's sort of at another level. It's more than just about people being safe. It's about making a choice to live different because of the person you've chosen to follow. And so I would agree. I think general morals, universal morals, absolutely. We should have those conversations with our kids. And encourage them in biblical values as well. But don't be upset if that's not their journey. It's a little bit like the prodigal son. When the prodigal son came to his father and said, "Give me my inheritance, I want to do my own thing," the response of the father was, "Okay." He didn't argue with him. He didn't try and talk him out of it. He didn't get angry at him, even though he was being downright offensive. He just said, "Okay, here it is." And that's kind of what God does with us as well. He says, "Okay, if you're not ready for me, that's all right. I'll be here when you come back." And I think that's how we need to be with our own children, is understand that as long as they know we're here when they get back, that they're going to take their own journey and God will lead them through.
Awesome.
Nobody's asked me any curly questions. What about you young people? You got any really hard questions for me?
I already have a question.
What's your question?
Yes.
Why say name?
You just talked about dogs.
Is it okay to do it while you're drunk?
Okay, is it okay to have sex while you're drunk? What you're saying is you're incapacitated. You can't.
One of you is sober.
One of you's sober. And so what you're saying is that the drunk person is initiating things, or the sober person's initiating things?
No.
Yeah. Look, I would say this. If you're the sober person and you're with a drunk person, I would say it'd be a big no-no, because you'd be taking advantage of somebody that can't make a choice for themselves. Drunk people generally have sex because they don't know how to make great choices, okay? And so drinking and having sex tends to go hand in hand. And so what I would say is this: come back to the old, what's going to be best for me in the long run? Rather than looking for it's okay under these circumstances, just say, what's going to be healthiest for me in the long run? Okay? Is it healthy for me to get drunk all the time? Probably not, because then I make other dumb decisions as well. All right? Is it good for me to take advantage of somebody when they're not able to make good decisions? No, probably not. So I would say then just have a blanket rule. Either I don't drink or I don't try and have sex while I'm drinking, or both would be even better. And, but that's a reasonable question, though, and good on you for asking.
Cool. Any other questions? Any comments?
Mace.
I think it's easier being parents of boys and girls.
Sure.
I'm going to speak from our point of view. I mean, our granddaughters come in and it's a whole dynamic. So I'm feeling for you.
Yeah.
Because what you can say to the boys, obviously is different to girls, but ultimately the responsibility, unfortunately, lies with the girls. Do they take contraceptive? Do they do whatever, right, wrong, whatever? And that's so being a parent of the
You're right, and as you know, we have a adopted daughter, and we know all too well, girls are very different to boys, and sometimes you do have to have those conversations with girls, because not all boys have been raised to do right by young girls, and unfortunately there's a lot of boys out there that don't do right, and so we've got to prepare them as best we can. Go for it.
We, like you, our son, we've both been married twice. And we have boys from both sides, but we have one between us. And we weren't married when we had him.
God does.
We were at church actually, we got saved.
Yeah.
And we were at church on a Sunday night, and the pastor said there's a couple and everybody thinks they're married and they're not.
Yeah.
Well, I knew straight away, you're not the kind of person. Just pastors. So we went out the front. Now, that was fixed.
Yeah.
We had that fixed. And we got married.
Right.
And that's lasted 35 years. So
Wow.
we're doing well.
Congratulations.
Yeah. But the thing is that if you think about stuff that goes on, to be married in this day and age is only sort of vital with God, because the world doesn't recognise your marriage.
Yeah.
You've got the same rights as a, what do they call it? De facto couple, legally, same rights.
That's why we.
And I wasn't going to get married again. I wasn't interested in getting married and work.
Yeah.
And so you look at that.
I had
But,
all the rights of a wife.
yeah.
So he introduced me as his wife, and they got to married.
And when you get Jesus into that changes stuff.
Yeah. You're right.
It changes it.
You're right.
Our kids, it's like same-sex couples now getting married.
Yeah.
That's quite abhorrent to me. However, it's legal to do that.
Sure.
And so we've got to pray for our kids and for our friends.
Yeah.
And we've got to tell them about Jesus. Change their life.
Yeah. I agree.
I don't know where we'd be with that. He's not going to be dead. I don't know. Oh, well,
Absolutely good.
it makes a difference.
And look, what you described, Rick, we completely understand, because
We
when
did the same thing.
we were the same thing. When we had Kai, we were not walking with Jesus. We had made the decision that there was no need to get married. We had both been married before.
Yeah.
We
saw
just
no,
weren't going to be pressed into it because
we just didn't, and none of our family really made a big deal of it. None of them pressured us or anything like that. And so we figured, well, whatever. We'll just be like a married couple. But the reason we made the decision ultimately was this. One, we recommitted our lives to Jesus. And then we asked the question, how do we want to raise our son?
Yeah.
Yep.
And we decided that we wanted to raise our son with Christian values. And so the first place we had to start was, okay, we've got to set the example with our marriage. And so we got married.
Yep.
And so I think you're right. I think it is very easy to explain away commitment as a de facto and say it's the same as marriage. I think the distinction between the two is this. With a marriage, even with a secular marriage, but even more so with a biblical marriage or a godly marriage, is this. With a marriage, you actually have to think twice before you get out of it. All right, and so there is always a process that will cause you to actually wrestle with the things that may need to be worked out. All right. You don't have that process with a de facto relationship. No. It is not as, I would say, as easy to get out of a marriage as it is to get out of a de facto relationship. And what that means is because good marriages have to be able to overcome obstacles. They have to be able to wrestle with difficulty. And if you make it hard, well, guess what? You'll wrestle with the difficulty and you might think twice before you divorce. I know Melanie and I probably wouldn't be together if we were still a de facto couple. But because we were married, we had to wrestle with some big stuff. And it forced us to contend with the idea of divorce and ask ourselves the question, were we prepared to go through that? And we weren't. And so we're still here today, thank goodness. But yeah, I think you're right. It's an easy mistake to make that de facto is the same as marriage. I don't think it is. And I'm not saying that anyone who's in a de facto relationship that I consider them less of a person. I know many people who are in de facto relationships and very loving, very committed. I'm not criticising people who are in de facto relationships, but to your point, if you're a believer, I would always encourage marriage because there's that extra level of commitment that you just don't get.
I actually have a friend that her and her partner have been together for a very long time, for over 20 years, and then they ended up separating. And I remember her saying to me, I probably wouldn't have made that decision. Now, there were very valid reasons that it ended up the way it did, but if they were married, they probably would make different choices. I think it just stops and makes you think, like Tarun said, just makes you think a little bit more about you've made this decision and you've stood before your friends and God, and committed your life to each other for the rest of your life. So I think that just makes you stop and think, okay. Yeah. How do I know if someone is the one? Oh, here you go. Okay, how do I know? How do I know if someone is the one God's got for me?
Okay, the old chestnut, girl one. All right. Okay, let me say this up front. This is going to be very unpopular, and you may not like to hear this. Churches love to say God has someone for you, the one person for you. The reality is God probably has dozens of people that you could be compatible with. All right? There are certain people that you are going to be more compatible with than other people. And so I think this idea of God picking out one specific person in the universe, in time, and saving them especially for you, I think it's a lovely idea. But in reality, I think even if you have the one, you've still got to work at your marriage. Even if you have your soulmate, as they say, you still have to fight to survive. Because the idea of the one or the soulmate is that this person will be so perfect that we will have this perfect relationship and there'll be no problems.
And it'll just work.
That's just never going to happen. Okay? Even if you've got the most perfect person in the universe like I do, you will still wrestle, you will still fight, you will still disagree. And so what I think you better to do is this, okay? Rather than looking for the one, ask God to give you the wisdom. Ask God to give you the wisdom to make the right choice when you meet somebody who you think you are compatible with. All right? Ask God to give you the wisdom and take your time. That's the other thing I would say.
Absolutely.
People rush too much in relationships. Take your time. Because if you take time, to quote a great theologian, Steve Harvey, he says this, wait 90 days. Because
Yeah,
you learn a
90
lot
days.
about somebody in 90 days.
That's
All right, if you can wait 90 days and they're still around and you still want to be with them, then there's a good chance you might be able to make it work. But if you can't hold out for more than 90 days, then forget about it. All right, so I would say don't look for the one. Ask God for wisdom to make a commitment to the person you are most compatible with.
I think, you know, like, I love you. I love my husband. I love my husband.
She's talking herself into
Some days I get up and I don't really like my husband very much, right? Because for whatever's going on, we've had a fight, whatever. But it's a choice that I make every day to be committed and to fight for it. And you know, this is what I said to someone recently. You know, you're always going to fight. You're always going to have issues. But it's making a choice that you're still going to stay and fight for it.
Yeah.
Now, the hard part is if that other person doesn't want to fight, right?
Yeah.
You know, but it's you're only accountable for your own actions, right?
Yeah.
So you have to get up every day and know that you're going to fight and you're making a choice about the relationship that you're in, irrespective. And you know, and if you've got God in the centre of your marriage, you can do amazing things.
And I would say this is, please dispense with the idea of being in love, all right? The whole idea of romantic love has only existed for the last 100 years. Before that, it didn't exist. The only people that fell in love were people that were having affairs in history. People that were married for either political reasons or family reasons. And so what they had to do was commit to somebody and choose to love them. And that's a completely different thing. Choosing to love somebody and being in love with somebody are two vastly different things. Being in love with somebody, you will last 5 minutes. Choosing to love somebody can last a lifetime if you choose to. And so if you're a young person trying to find a relationship, because I know that this question has come from online, if you're a young person that's trying to find a relationship, choose somebody that you're willing to contend with and you're willing to choose every day.
Yeah.
Don't choose somebody who you fall madly in love with thinking that they're perfect because they gave you butterflies for 5 minutes.
But
Alright?
that also puts the burden on the other person to make you happy for the rest of your life.
Yeah, and you can't do it.
And that's
It's
not
impossible.
sustainable. So young people, this is really important for you to hear, right? You know, your happiness is dependent upon you and not somebody else.
Yeah.
You know, and so if you're looking for a relationship, you know, whatever it is, you've got to be happy within yourself. You can't
But
put it over someone else.
I'll also just put this out there. In India, most people don't get married for love. They get married because their parents arrange a marriage. Divorce rate in India is 5%. Divorce rate in Western countries is over 50%. So you tell me, in-love marriages versus arranged marriages, which ones work? I think making a choice to commit to somebody is what works over trying to find the one.
And I know we kind of deviated into marriage here, right, a relationship, but I would say this, whether you're in a relationship or in a marriage, really important, this is really good information for you guys to know, right? If you're in a marriage or in a relationship, put great people that have gone before you, whatever season you're in, you're looking for someone that's in a season just ahead of you, that you put those people around you to go on that journey with you. So if you're starting out as a boyfriend and a girlfriend, get someone that's been in a relationship for a bit longer. If you're newlywed, find someone that's been married. Because you can then have all of these conversations that we're having tonight in a really safe space with people that are just that little bit ahead on the journey than you are, that are going to be able to speak into your life. It's going to be someone you trust, someone that's going to be honest with you and call you on stuff. You do not want people in your life that are going to just say yes to everything, because I can tell you now that if it wasn't for having people in our life that challenged us on the way we were living our life, the decisions we were making, we would not be together today.
Yeah.
It's because we had people in our life that were willing to say, no, you're full of it. You know, you're making wrong decisions. So put good people in your life that are just ahead of you, that go on that journey with you. Anyway, that's my little passion.
Was there another question from online?
Okay, so how do I honour, and I don't know if we've already answered this, how do I honour God with sex?
How do you honour God with sex? What? Get married first.
Get married first.
How do you honour God with sex? Get married first. There's an old theologian named Martin Luther, and it's not Martin Luther King Jr., the black civil rights activist. Okay, Martin Luther was the guy that started the Protestant Reformation back in the 1500s, and he was a Catholic priest. And when he discovered that he didn't agree with everything that the Catholic Church was teaching on marriage and sex, he actually got married, and it was actually to a nun. And he and this nun had 13 children. They had a wonderful marriage and a wonderful life. But he said this. He said, sex within marriage is a sacrament so holy that I could have sex with my wife and get up and take communion straight after, and God would be pleased. So how do you honour God with sex? You get married and you keep sex within the fireplace that He created for it, and don't dishonour Him by putting it in the middle of your living room.
Yeah, I like it. Any other questions, comments?
Amazing.
Awesome.
All right. Well, I hope tonight's been helpful.
Yeah.
And I want you guys to know, online and in person, I want you guys to always know this, okay? We live in a world that has quite different views on sex and sexuality, all right? And I want you to know that this is always a safe space if you have to ask questions. You can always come to me or Pastor Mel or somebody on our team and say, hey, I've got this question. This is what my school's teaching, or this is what my friends are saying, or this is what I saw on TikTok. If you need to talk to somebody, it's always a safe space. I don't want this church to ever be a place where anybody feels condemned or judged or rejected because they're not understanding something about sex or sexuality. And even if you're having feelings or desires that you know don't necessarily fit in with a biblical view, it's still okay to ask the questions. And I would say to all believers this, all right? Romans 1 lays out a whole bunch of sinful sexual activities. And it says, God gave them over to their own desires. And what we have tended to do as a church is we've tended to say, hey, people who engage in that stuff, not good. God rejected them. Okay? That's not what it says. God didn't reject them. It says God gave them to their desires. It means He let them do what they needed to do. But this is what I want to say to all believers, is the second chapter of Romans. We never read this in context of the first chapter. It says, but you who consider yourself righteous, do not point a finger of judgment at those people, because if you do, you will be judged with the same judgment. We as a church need to be much, much better at loving those people who are outside of what God would intend for their life. We are not called to judge them. We are not called to condemn them. We are called to love them. And as Jesus says, before you pick the speck out of their eye, look at the log in your own eye. Because even if you think you're righteous, if you're pointing the finger, then you are judging yourself. So I want authentic church to be a place where people feel accepted no matter what journey they're on. And this is a safe place where you can ask hard questions and it will always be treated with dignity. Cool?